All right, so today we're going to talk about the different types of sampling methods. So recall, statistics involves collecting data from an appropriate or representative sample and using that information to make inferences about the population of interest. So in many cases, selecting a representative sample is one of the main challenges of the statistical study. So a representative sample is a sample in which the relevant characteristics of the sample members match those of the population of interest. So for example, if we were studying the variable average income or shoe size of all Americans, we would likely not want to use professional basketball players as our sample. However, if our variable of interest was birth month, then professional basketball players might be a perfectly representative sample. So we will discuss the 5 most common sampling methods below. So our first one is a simple random sampling. So a simple random sampling or sample. So we choose a sample of n items in such a way that every sample of size n in the population is equally likely of being the sample actually selected. So for example, if you draw names from a hat or use a random number generator. We then have what we call stratified sampling, which you divide the population of interest into subgroups or strata that you want to make sure are representative. So note, the subgroups should be different based on some characteristic. So then you take a simple random sample of individuals from each of the subgroups. Usually the size of the sample from each subgroup is proportional to the size of the subgroup in the entire population. You then combine all of the samples from the subgroups to form your sample. So for example, let's say you divide a population of high school students up into freshmen, sophomore, junior, and seniors. You then take a random sample of 25 students from each grade level, assuming each grade level is equal in size. You then combine this 4 subgroups of 25 students into your sample for 100 students. So the biggest thing with stratified sampling is you're taking a sample from each of the grade levels. So you're not sampling all of the freshmen or all of the juniors, just a portion of them. And I say that because our next type of sampling is a cluster sampling, and it looks similar to stratified sampling, but there is that little bit of difference. So cluster sampling. So you divide the population into clusters or groups that are as similar as possible, and then randomly select some of the clusters to make your sample. So if a cluster is selected to be in the sample, all members of that cluster are included in the sample. So that's a really big difference. So stratified, right, is sort of some, cluster is all from that specific cluster you chose. We then have what we call systematic sampling. Which you would select a sample by systematically choosing individuals from your population to be included in the sample. So for example, you make a list of individuals in the population and then include every 30th individual in the sample. So it's some type of sort of numerical difference between each of the individuals. So every third person or every 30th person, so you get this systematic sampling. Our last really type that we definitely don't want to do, but tends to happen a lot, is what we call a convenience sample. And this is where you use a sample that is convenient to select. So it's not usually representative, and so we usually don't want a convenient sample. But it says an example would be if we wanted a sample of GCC students, I could say, well, I'm just going to use the students in my classroom, right? That'd be easy to do. But again, the students in my classroom probably are not representative of the college, right? Especially like in our statistics course. There's specific majors that need to take that course, and so it would not be representative of all of the students at GCC. So we do have to be careful with that. The last type that we have, which is not really sampling because it's coming from the entire population, is a census. So we sometimes want to collect data from the entire population. In this case, you would conduct a census. And a census is when every individual in the population of interest is measured. And so we have a census that we take in the US, right? It's very expensive to do, and we don't do it every year because there's just so much data. It takes a lot of time to look at the data and analyze it. But that is our best chance of getting everyone in the population. And unfortunately, just with our US our census, it's not always the case. We don't get every response from everyone, but it's the closest thing that we have. All right, so let's take a look at example 1. And it says it says the quality control officer at a manufacturing plant needs to determine what percentage of items in a batch are defective. The following are different sampling techniques that could be used by the officer. Classify each as simple random sample, stratified sample, systematic sample, cluster sample, or convenience sample. And so we're going to do A through E together, and then I have some for you to try. So A says the officer lists all of the batches in a given month. The number of defective items is counted in randomly selected batches. So because we're just choosing sort of these random batches, it would be a simple random sample. So we're just choosing random samples and counting the number of defective items. For B, it says the officer takes the first 10 batches and counts the number of defective items. So if I think of this, right, just the first 10 batches, so there's really no randomization there, and just counting the number of defective items. This would just be convenience, right? Whichever comes first, I'm going to select that, and that'll be sort of what my sample is. So this would be a convenience sample. This is something we would not want to do. So for C, it says the officer groups the batches made in a month and into which shift they are made. The number of defective items is counted in randomly selected batches in each shift. So, right, so we are, made in a month into which shift they are made. So we're separating them, right, into the shifts, and then the number of defective items is counted in randomly selected batches in each shift. So we're taking, right, simple random samples of each of these batches. We're separating them into strata, so it would be a stratified sample. So now it says the officer chooses every 15th batch of the line and counts the number of defective items in each chosen batch. So because we're going right every 15th, this is going to be our systematic sample. And so our last one says the officer divides the batches made in a month into which day they were made. Then certain days are picked, and every batch made that day is counted to determine the number of defective items. So if you look at it, this is similar to letter C, right? It starts off to say, this one, C says shift, this one says day. And then it says certain days were picked, and all, right, every batch made that day is counted. So every batch made that day. So the idea is all. So this is going to be our cluster sample. All right. So what you might want to do now, if you want to pause the video and go ahead and try A through D by yourself to see maybe what you find, and then you can start it again, and I'll walk you through them. But I'm going to go ahead and walk you through them. So it says identify the sampling techniques used in the study. So A says a student asked 20 friends to participate in a psychology study. So if you think about this, right, 20 friends, you're not really choosing a random sample at all, right? No representative sample. This would be a type of convenience sample. You're not really going much out of the way to get this sample here. B says using random digit dialing, researchers asked 1,500 U.S. adults their plans for the holidays. So a random digit dialing usually has to do with a simple random sample. Now, C says an ice cream taster chooses every 25th quart of ice cream to taste test. So since we're doing it right at a specific interval, right, every 25th quart, this would be a systematic sample. So D says GCC divides their student population by majors and then randomly selects and questions some students from each major, right? So some students. So this idea would be it's stratified. So a stratified sample. And E says GCC divides their student populations by majors and then randomly selects 5 majors and surveys all students in that major. So we're selecting 5 majors, but we're choosing all of the students in that major. So this would be a cluster sample. So again, these are ways, different types of sampling methods that we can use in a statistics study, a statistical study.